So, chapter 7 is actually the continuation of the previous chapter in some sense. This is titled A Tragedy Continued. And the reason is it talks about the same incident, right? The incident being meat eating, right? And in chapter 6, we hadn't seen Gandhi commit the act of eating meat. However, we had come across his arguments in, his debate, the debate he was conducting with himself, arguing for and against meat eating. And of course, we were also introduced to this friend, unnamed friend, who uh, induced in Gandhi the idea of eating meat and quote unquote virtues of eating meat. So Gandhi had his debate. You are already aware that there were several strong factors in favor, strong arguments in favor of meat eating, beginning with, of course, British colonialism and the fact that the British were meat eaters. Generally meat eaters, of course, he can't speak for all British people, but yes, generally meat eaters. And his friend had portrayed meat eating as a reason for British people being stronger than Indians, and thus uh, facilitating British rule. And so Gandhi saw that uh, as a situation which could only be addressed if Indians also started eating meat, and he believed that that would make all Indians as strong as the British, and Indians would probably be able to fight them back. So that was his hope, one of the most important reasons. The other two reasons, of course, um, is one is very personal, with Gandhi saying that I'm very cowardly. I'm even I'm even my wife is way more brave than I am. I'm afraid of the dark. I fancy there are thieves around me, ghosts around me, all of that stuff. So he believed that meat eating would solve that problem, his cowardice being the problem here. But also he also realized that he was personally, as an individual, he was quite weak, not physically strong, not well built. And in contrast to his friend and his elder brother, who were already meat eaters, he was able to see a very glaring contrast, because his friend was well built, was good in sports, as he mentions. Even his brother, meat eating brother, was quite strong, significantly stronger than him. And Gandhi, like he said in the previous chapter, he was not strong at all. He was terrible in sports. In fact, he did not love sports at all, if you remember from the earlier chapters where he talks about education, and where he mentions that he would stay away from all kinds of sports, whether it's gymnastics or football or cricket. So overall, in chapter 6, he had come to the conclusion that he is going to eat meat, right? So he was, after this long debate, he had come to the conclusion that it was necessary for him to consume meat for all of those reasons. And the arguments against eating meat were chiefly tradition, right? That Gujarat, where he hails from, is the province of India where uh, the ideals of Jainism and Vaishnavism are held strongest, right, as compared to any other place in India. So those were factors which which were arguments against meat eating. But nonetheless, at the end of chapter 6, it seemed that Gandhi had made his decision that he would consume meat. So that said, let's look at the excerpts of chapter 7, where the tragedy continues as the chapter goes. The title of the chapter goes. So, so the first excerpt goes as follows. So the day came. It was difficult fully to describe my condition. There were, on the one hand, the zeal for reform and the novelty of making a momentous departure in life. There was, on the other, the shame of hiding like a thief to do this very thing, right? So the duality of this decision, or to put in a different way, the conflict that this debate that he had with himself and the act of eating meat was momentous, right? Uh, because on the one hand, he had this enthusiasm for reform, reform obviously in a very political sense, where the British would be thrown away and Indians would gain political power. That would be reform. And on the other hand, it would be marking a very significant departure from his tradition, his culture, his family culture, of course, and also from a departure from the tradition that has been passed down from generation after generation. Uh, but on the other hand, he would also have to hide like a thief to eat meat, because he could not come and confess eating meat to his family. So, well, he says he tried eating meat. And the first time he tried, he says, I simply could not eat it. I was sick and had to leave off eating. So, uh, now this is, as he has previously mentioned, that he was not eating meat because he anticipated that it would be the tastiest thing in the world, right? It was not for the palate. This is exactly what he had mentioned in chapter 6. So we know for a fact that he had no he was not he was not eating meat out of gluttony, right? He was just eating meat because there were too many arguments in favor of eating meat. Some were political, some were personal, some out of sheer pride. Because remember, he is cowardly while his wife is significantly valiant, significantly more courageous than he is. So for all of those reasons, uh, the weight of reasons were heavier on the side of meat eating, and so he tried. But he did not like it. So it was not for it was not for the purpose of taste, and he felt sick when he tried having it. He says, I also knew that if my mother and father came to know of my having become a meat eater, they would be deeply shocked. Now the reason for this is obvious, right? Now uh, now you have to remember that tradition is a very significant aspect, and breaking off from a tradition is also a significant departure from life, right? And in Gandhi's case here, it's meat eating. For you or for me, uh, it might be another act which marks a significant departure from family traditions or traditions in the part of the world where we live in. I mean, in West Bengal, if you think, meat eating is much more common, right? It's significantly more common. In fact, if you look at the map of India, and if you try to draw the percentage of meat eaters by state, you'll probably find that some states like West Bengal, Kerala, the meat eating is much more common as compared to these states. So it is. So here, uh, it's I won't say it's easier, because there are a lot of factors, family traditions and culture. All of those factors are significant. Of course, there is no downplaying, and since there is no downplaying, hence the problem, hence the moral dilemma which Gandhi faces. For him, departing from that culture was a challenge, and eating meat would be a departure from that culture, right? So that was a major conflict, and this is the reason why, if his parents came to know about it, they would be deeply shocked. Because um, remember, his parents do not belong to a tradition where someone in the family has eaten meat before, right? Or who eat it. So hence it is such a big deal, right? For people from other parts of the world, uh, the most obvious question could be, why is this such a big deal? It is a big deal because this is a cultural matter. It is a matter of tradition, right? It's a matter of culture for Gandhi, and eating meat is a departure, is a break from that culture. And when his parents get to know about it, obviously they would be deeply shocked. In their lifetime, therefore, this is something he decided. In their lifetime, in the lifetime of Gandhi's parents, meat eating must be out of the question. When they were no more and I have found my freedom, I will eat meat openly, but until that moment arrives, I will abstain from it. So, this was Gandhi's decision. So, you see what happened, the sequence of events. So, first, his friend tried to, bring him to eat meat. His friend tried to convince him that meat eating would be a virtue. And then Gandhi had several arguments in favor. And when he brought those arguments and counter arguments together after his debate, he concluded that the weight of arguments in favor of meat eating were heavier, and hence he decided to be a meat eater. But then he did not succeed. He tried it. Remember, experiments with truth. So he experimented, and his experiment, well, we all know how he felt after he experimented. He says, I was sick and had to leave off eating. Now, his experiment was a failure, and he it it increasingly dawned upon him that if his parents came to know about it, it would be a disaster. Yeah, it would be a shock for them, and that he did not want. Remember, you know, he was blind to the fate of his, blind to the fault of his elders, and he was very devoted towards his parents. These are some things we already know. So he decided that in the lifetime of his parents, he wouldn't eat meat, and when they pass away, he would do it openly, but as long as they are alive, he will abstain from it. Okay, so he says, this decision I communicated to my friend, and I have never since gone back to meat. My parents never knew that two of their sons had become meat eaters, right? Not much explaining to do here. So Gandhi, he made that promise, and he communicated it to his friend, and finally he stopped eating meat. And in fact, even after the death of his parents, he didn't go back to eating meat. Uh, the same company would have led me into faithfulness to my wife, but I was saved by the skin of the teeth. The same company refers to the same friend, the same quote unquote bad company, which is according to his wife, as mentioned in the previous chapter. But he says that even though this friend, this bad friend, unnamed bad company, would try to lead me into faithlessness to my wife, I was saved nonetheless. I prevented from being led astray. So one of the reasons of my differences with my wife was undoubtedly the company of this friend, right? A very significant point here. I was both a devoted and a jealous husband, and this friend fanned the flame of my suspicions about my wife, right? So clearly bad company, right? Uh, a wife, if she suspects her husband, will keep quiet, but if her husband suspects her, she's ruined. A Hindu wife may not seek divorce in a law court. Law has no remedy for her. Now, I want you to note that this is a very significant excerpt here, right? Because because Gandhi here makes a very crucial point about women's rights, right? So far he has spoken about education, he has spoken about breaking off from tradition and how it affects you. But here, uh, now we have already seen Gandhi admit that he has been wrong several times in his life in how he, in his attitude towards his wife. He has confessed being an authoritative husband. He has also confessed that such authoritarianism was wrong of him. He also confessed that it was out of sheer pride that he did not listen to her when she warned him against this friend who has led him to eat meat, and has also tried to lead him to be faithless, um, to his wife. So you see, he did not listen to his wife earlier. But as he grows up, as Gandhi, you know, confronts with the world, as he learns, as he grows into a Mahatma, right? As Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi grows into a Mahatma, he realizes how wrong he was in his ideas about women, and very specifically in how he was wrong about his own wife. So in this excerpt, this very crucial excerpt, he makes a very important point about women's rights. He says how society acts towards women. He says if a wife suspects her husband, she will be quiet because she really cannot do much about it. But if the husband starts suspecting the wife, she's ruined. Her life is hell after that, right? And why is this? He says a Hindu wife may not seek divorce in the law court. Remedy, law has no remedy for her. Now, the reason is, remember the time period when Gandhi was married to Kasturbai. That's the late 19th century. Of course, there were no women's rights, right? Women's rights were not enshrined in any constitution. Now you already know. I have spoken about suffragette before. So you know that women did not even have the right to vote in many of the countries which we today call developed countries. In countries like United Kingdom, United States, I'm not talking about India here, I'll come to that later, but in countries such as the United States and United Kingdom, women had to literally fight, physically fight men, even, right? Because there were protests, and there would be, you know, men who were against women's rights did all kinds of things to stop women from gaining certain rights as simple as voting, right? Now these are some things when India became independent. the committee that formed the constitution, led by Ambedkar and some other obviously stalwarts in law. Uh, these were put into the Indian constitution by default, right? So in India, in independent India, I must add, women always had a right to vote. But a lot of these countries, these Western countries, that was not always the case. It is only in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, that after years and perhaps decades of struggle, women finally earned the right to vote. And remember, voting is very significant because that leads to representation in parliament, that leads to women speaking about their own problems, right? So Gandhi, I must highlight, makes a very significant, very important point about women's rights. He highlights the fact that uh, the society here is designed in such a way, right? The schemes of society are such in India that Hindu wife uh, cannot even seek divorce in a law court because there is no law in her favor. Now we know that a lot of acts have been passed since. You know that sati was a practice at one time. Widows couldn't marry. Widows couldn't remarry. They were thrown into the flame of the dead husband's pyre, right? There were no school for girls. So in the 19th and early 20th century, a slew of reforms by stalwarts from Jyotirao Phule to Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, and later in the 20th century by someone like Ambedkar. So these are important figures. Of course, I must add Gandhi's name because, like I said, here he highlights a very important point of there being no law in support of women. But it is significant that such an important person as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi or Mahatma Gandhi brings out this point. And note that as Gandhi realizes his mistakes as a man playing the role of a husband, and thousands and millions of people followed him, thousands and thousands of people must have read his autobiography. You you can surely assume how much impact it would have had. The fact that that Gandhi of all people highlights the problem that Hindu wives face in society, right? So a very significant point. And when it comes to Gandhi's thoughts of women and women's rights, this becomes a very important point. So we end the chapter a tragedy here. Chapter 7 ends here, and also this long chapter beginning with chapter 6 continuing through chapter 7, beginning with meat eating, weighing in arguments in favor and against meat eating, and finally making a very crucial point about the situation of women and um, the the fact that there are no laws to help or protect women in any way. Women couldn't even own property for much of history. So significant points made by Gandhi, and as I have explained before, the tragedy in the chapter's title refers to the act of eating meat, the act of breaking away from tradition, right? The act of sinning, as far as Gandhi is concerned, right? So we end our lecture here on chapter 7.